Thank you, Ruth. And I'm now going to spend some time talking about whether companies and governments which supply natural gas to Europe should be concerned with decarbonisation targets. And the first thing to say is that the increase in the severity of the targets from COP21 to net zero is really extremely important for gas demand. What happens when you move to net zero is that all fossil fuel emissions have to decline much more rapidly than under COP21. And what you find then is that we need to start in Europe to decrease natural gas demand pretty much from now until 2030, and then even faster from 2030. And the decline post-2030 is really extremely steep. This means that by 2030, Europe probably has to have seen a fall in gas demand of between 25% and 1/3 in order to be on track for net zero by 2050. In terms of what gas demand would look like under net zero in 2050, there would need to be no more than around 50 to 60 billion cubic meters of unabated natural gas, which is around 10% of the demand that we've seen in the late 2010s, early 2020s. Now, this is not an immediate threat to those who supply gas to Europe, because European gas production is falling so quickly that in fact the level of imports which will be required will be similar or even perhaps slightly above what we've seen in the last few years. Nevertheless, the longer term prospects are going to be very difficult. But before I get on to talking about individual countries, I want to spend a moment on what the EU policies are likely to look like in respect of natural gas. In October of last year, the Commission published its methane strategy, which essentially focused on specific emissions of natural gas from imports into the EU. This is a complicated document, but the part which is particularly important is the mixture of persuasion and compulsion in respect of exporters of natural gas to the EU. The Commission has proposed a series of methodological and reporting requirements, which are quite complicated, but the most important aspect for gas exporters is that they are going to be required to adopt these methodologies. And if they don't adopt the methodologies by a certain date in the future, we don't have that date yet, probably they will be assigned a so-called default standard of methane. Now, the Commission has said in its strategy that it will provide assistance to suppliers to meet those standards. But if suppliers do not sign on to these methodologies, then they will be assigned a default standard. And what that means is that their emissions will be deemed to be at a certain level, and that will require additional payments of either taxes or a lower price when the gas is imported into the EU. Now, what can exporters do about this? Well, there is the possibility of incorporating some biomethane into deliveries to the EU instead of pure methane. There is the possibility of substituting hydrogen for some of the unabated natural gas, either directly as hydrogen or with reforming of the methane when it arrives at the EU border. Nevertheless, even if hydrogen is adopted, this is going to require carbon capture and storage, where we are still quite close to the start of carbon capture and storage facilities being developed on any kind of large scale in the EU. Now, if we take a look at what countries are involved, what I've described might be considered to be very complicated. But in fact, only 6 countries account for 90%, probably much more than 90% in most years, of the natural gas which is delivered to Europe. I'm going to go through those countries and describe the different attributes that they have. So the first country is Norway. Now, Norway is an exporter of mainly pipeline gas and some liquefied natural gas, or LNG, to the EU. And what we see with Norway is that the country already has such low methane emissions, and indeed greenhouse gas emissions in general, from its natural gas supplies, that any standard that the EU is likely to adopt will not be a problem. But Norway is, if you like, an exception in those 6 countries. If I was to make a generalization about the attitudes of the other 5 countries, I would say that it ranges between those governments and companies believing either that maybe the EU is being a little bit ambitious and it will not succeed in its propositions for emissions reduction, or introducing these rather stringent measures like the methane strategy. The other thing to say is that in their own countries, climate and carbon reduction is not such a very high item on the agenda as it is in Europe. But let me take them in turn. Like Norway, Russia is a very large exporter of pipeline gas and a much smaller exporter of LNG to Europe. And the Russians have said very clearly that they believe they will be able to deal with the European measures. They are proposing a different technology to carbon capture and storage, which is pyrolysis. And that makes hydrogen much easier to develop because the process produces solid carbon, which is much easier to store. Then we have an almost equal exporter of pipeline gas and LNG, which is Algeria. Algeria has said nothing about decarbonisation in the EU, and we believe it probably hasn't paid a great deal of attention to this. But as I'm going to go on and discuss next, any country which exports LNG has other options than delivering it to Europe. And this is where we come to the United States, to Qatar and Nigeria, which are the other 3 major exporters of gas, but in the form of LNG to Europe. Now, what those countries have the option of doing is to export their LNG not to Europe, but to jurisdictions, and particularly Asia, where carbon and greenhouse gas reduction is less stringent, where targets are less immediate, and in fact, where prices can tend to be higher than in Europe. There are other countries which are smaller and probably less important. Trinidad and Tobago, an LNG exporter, Azerbaijan and Libya, mainly pipeline gas exporters. But these countries are not as important as the 6 that I've just talked about. So let me draw this to a close and re-ask the question that I posed at the start. Should these countries be worried about the measures that Europe is taking and the targets that Europe has adopted? And the answer is yes, they should, but probably not immediately. Norway has the least to be worried about, given that, as I said, its emissions are relatively, in fact, extremely low, and also the country, and indeed the government, is a leader in hydrogen and CCS technology, with many projects, one actually started and others very much in an advanced stage of preparation. The other countries probably will take longer, and the question for Europeans, and particularly the European Commission, is whether they will be amenable to persuasion to reduce their emissions from natural gas, or whether this will turn into a big fight and huge litigation in terms of WTO and extraterritoriality, and therefore that could well turn into a very, very difficult discussion between the Commission and those governments. So, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was very interesting. And just to get right back at your final question, what do you think? What is the most probable for these 5 to 6 countries then that are the big exporters of gas to Europe? Will there be a fight, or will there be some kind of negotiations where, in particular, maybe these 5 bigger countries that you were mentioning will have to take into consideration the requirements from the EU? And if yes, when is that going to happen? You did say it's going to be in a while, but maybe not now. So what do you see there coming?
Okay, thank you very much. And you'll see that I've unfortunately had to run up to a different part of the house because of some external noise that I have no control over outside the house.
Okay.
So what I would say is, I strongly advise persuasion rather than compulsion. If the EU tries to go the way of saying, we will impose this on you, then I think we're in the hands of the lawyers for quite a few years. And there's really 2 big building blocks here. The first one is, how are we measuring these emissions, which for methane is a serious problem. It's less so for CO2. But the measurement of the emissions and the potential for disputing the measurement of the emissions is a serious obstacle. The next serious obstacle, as I mentioned in the short presentation, is essentially legal. Can the EU actually impose standards on these countries under WTO, and also imposing extraterritorial laws and regulations? And my feeling is that probably at the end of the day, rather as we did in relation to liberalisation, it can. But let's not forget that liberalisation took decades to introduce, and there were major fights, international legal fights, competition law fights with these countries. And I don't think we haven't got time to go through that again. What we have to find is a way of agreeing standards where there will probably need to be some assistance, there will need to be give and take, and the EU will need to listen as much as it has to talk.
Mm. But do you think the EU would be interested in sort of making their targets less ambitious just to meet the exporters? Or could the exporting countries say that, okay, forget it, the EU is not that an important market for us, the US is still the largest consumer of gas in the world, let's just put all on one horse and go in that direction? Is that something that might happen?
Well, what I mentioned in the presentation was that if you're an LNG exporter, in other words, if you don't have a pipeline which leads directly into Europe, you have the option of exporting your LNG to other countries around the world.
Yeah.
And I think LNG exporters will do that. I don't see the EU politically being able to soften those targets. What I see potentially happening is that, this was mentioned by other speakers, it will be customers that will decide, well, if these countries will not adjust their emissions, perhaps we would rather import gas or develop other fuels, even if it's more costly, from lower emission sources. And so I think it will need to be communicated with all of the gas exporting countries. Okay, we may not be able to force you to agree these standards, but if you don't agree them, then your gas or your LNG will either be worth less, or nobody will import it in Europe because it doesn't meet our standards.
With that, I think we should just say stop for now, Jonathan. Thank you a lot for an interesting presentation and also a short interaction afterwards. You will, of course, join us for the panel discussion later on. So I'll just say hang on for now, and we'll see you again quite soon.